Picture Napoleon Bonaparte. You probably see one hand tucked into his coat, an enormous hat, and a very small, angry man trying to conquer Europe. There's just one problem with that picture. Napoleon was not unusually short. The tiny emperor in our collective memory was built from incompatible rulers, affectionate nicknames, unusually tall guards, and some of the most effective political cartoons ever printed. This is Pip's fact orbit, where one familiar fact gets measured twice. When Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821, people around him recorded his height as a little over 5 French feet and 2 French inches. Read that with a modern British or American ruler, and you get about 5'2" or 1'57". That sounds tiny, but the words foot and inch were hiding a trap. Before metric measurements became universal, Europe was covered with local units. A foot was not one fixed length. The old French pied, often called the pied du roi, was about 32.5 centimeters. The British foot was 30.48 centimeters. 2 centimeters does not sound dramatic until you stack 5 of those feet on top of one another. The same written measurement could describe 2 very different people. 5 French feet, 2 French inches, and several smaller lines converts to roughly 1 meter 68 or 69. In British units, that is around 5'6½". One contemporary English measurement connected with the making of Napoleon's coffin put him at 5 feet 7 inches. The records are not perfectly identical, but they cluster around the same conclusion. Napoleon was nowhere near 5'2" in modern English measure. You can see the arithmetic. 5 old French feet contribute a little more than 162 centimeters. 2 French inches add about 5.5 more. The final lines, each a fraction of an inch, bring the total close to 169. Perform the same calculation with shorter British units, and the result collapses. The mystery is not hidden in Napoleon's bones. It is hidden in the conversion table. Was 1 meter 69 tall? Not by today's standards in many countries. But that is the wrong comparison. The useful question is whether he looked unusually short beside Frenchmen living around 1800. Historians at the Fondation Napoleon describe him as average for his period. Estimates of average height are never perfectly tidy because armies measured selected recruits and surviving records do not represent everyone. Still, there is no evidence for the miniature figure in popular culture. So why do people keep seeing him that way? First, Napoleon spent a lot of time beside human measuring sticks chosen for their height. His imperial guard included imposing grenadiers. Tall soldiers in towering bearskin caps were designed to look intimidating. Put a man of ordinary height in the middle of them, add enormous hats and ceremonial uniforms, and the eye makes the emperor seem smaller than he was. Second, his soldiers called him le petit caporal, the little corporal. That sounds like a comment about height when translated literally. In context, it was an affectionate nickname linking the general to ordinary soldiers. Petit can communicate familiarity, not just physical size. A nickname is not a medical chart, but repetition made it easy for later audiences to treat it like one. Then came the caricaturists. Britain and France were at war for much of Napoleon's rise. British newspapers could not defeat the French army on a page, but artists could shrink its leader. James Gillray repeatedly drew Little Boney as a furious, childish, vulnerable figure. In one famous 1803 print inspired by Gulliver's Travels, King George III holds a tiny Napoleon in his palm and examines him through a magnifying glass. The joke did several jobs at once. It reassured British viewers that the terrifying conqueror across the channel could be contained. It turned imperial ambition into childish tantrums. And it reduced a complicated enemy to a visual idea that could be understood before anyone read a word. Gillray did not need viewers to believe that the drawing was anatomically accurate. Caricature exaggerates. A huge head can suggest vanity. A tiny body can suggest weakness. A storm of papers, swords, and exploding furniture can turn politics into comedy. But when the same exaggeration appears again and again, the symbol starts competing with the person. These prints were the social media of their moment. They were displayed in shop windows, discussed in coffee houses, and copied by other publishers. Even someone who never bought a print could recognize its characters. Gillray borrowed the language of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, where changes of scale turned politics into absurdity. Napoleon became Gulliver in the giant king's hand, dangerous in Europe, but safely tiny on British paper. The visual joke crossed class and language barriers faster than a careful paragraph about strategy ever could. In another famous print, The Plum Pudding in Danger, British Prime Minister William Pitt and Napoleon carve up the globe as if it were dinner. Pitt is tall and lean. Napoleon is smaller, impatient, and reaching across the table. The print is political satire, not a height record. Yet its proportions help teach generations what Napoleon was supposed to look like. Napoleon used propaganda too. French paintings presented him crossing the Alps on a rearing horse, standing calmly in imperial robes, or commanding battlefields with effortless control. The real Alpine crossing was less cinematic. But both sides understood the same rule. An image can become more durable than an event. Look at the competing silhouettes. French official art lifts Napoleon upward with a horse, a cloak, and a diagonal pointing toward destiny. British satire bends him downward over a table, traps him inside a hand, or surrounds him with broken furniture. One side stretches authority, the other compresses it. Neither artist needs to falsify a written measurement, because posture, costume, and composition do the persuasive work before numbers appear. That is the cleverest part of this story. The British caricature succeeded because they did not merely say Napoleon was dangerous. They gave danger a reusable character, the tiny, furious tyrant. The French answered with the heroic emperor. Neither image was neutral, but the funny one was easier to repeat. After Napoleon's death, the joke acquired a second life through popular psychology. The phrase Napoleon complex came to describe the idea that a short man compensates by acting aggressive, ambitious, or controlling. It is often linked loosely to Alfred Adler's ideas about inferiority and compensation, but scholars note that Adler did not establish Napoleon complex as a clinical diagnosis. The phrase belongs more to folk psychology than to a recognized disorder. Modern studies of height and competitive behavior have produced narrow and mixed findings. They do not justify diagnosing a stranger from his height. The stereotype can even become circular. If a short man is assertive, people call it compensation. If a tall man behaves the same way, they call it confidence. And Napoleon himself is a spectacularly bad mascot for the idea. He was not abnormally short for his time, and reducing his political choices, military skill, ambition, and catastrophic wars to insecurity about centimeters explains almost nothing. The myth survived because several small errors supported one another. An old French foot was read as a modern English foot. An affectionate nickname sounded literal in translation. Elite guards created a misleading comparison. Enemy cartoonists supplied an unforgettable character. Then popular psychology attached a label that repeated the original assumption. There is also a lesson about historical averages. Saying Napoleon was average does not mean every Frenchman stood at exactly the same mark. Nutrition, region, age, and the way military records selected recruits all matter. Historians therefore give ranges rather than one magical national number. The responsible conclusion is modest. The available evidence does not make Napoleon exceptionally short among his contemporaries. That is enough to dismantle the cartoon version without replacing it with a new exaggeration. None of those pieces alone had to create the myth. Together, they made it feel obvious. So, how tall was Napoleon? The strongest surviving measurements place him around 1 meter 68 to 69, about 5'6.5" in modern British measure. Ordinary for his place and time. The famous 5'2" number was not necessarily written incorrectly. It was read with the wrong ruler. Napoleon conquered much of Europe, lost an empire, and died in exile. But the British cartoonists won one campaign that lasted 2 centuries. They made millions of people picture him at a height he probably never was. The next time someone mentions the Napoleon complex, remember the real, complex thing was the measurement. Subscribe to Pip's Fact Orbit for another true story that gets stranger when you look closely.